I'm excited about this next panel, and I think you will be as well. We have a former senior member of the U.S. House who led the Health Subcommittee and a two-time former head of the FDA. And the session is going to be moderated by Dr. Patrick Ellinor, who is the inaugural head of the MGB Heart and Vascular Institute. Dr. Ellinor is a true physician investigator. He's a cardiologist, an electrophysiologist, a geneticist, and an industry go-to. He's also a visionary leader in the largest disease area in all of healthcare, and he is driving a new cardiovascular chapter in the storied history of Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General Hospital. Dr. Patrick Ellinor will moderate this session, and I know you're going to enjoy it. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for that warm introduction, and it's an absolute delight to be here to moderate this session. I'm joined by two incredible leaders in their respective area. Dr. Robert Califf. Dr. Califf hails from Duke University, where he went to medical school and undergraduate, rose quickly through the academic ranks to professor there, and importantly founded the Duke Clinical Research Institute. He also spent time as the twice commissioner of the FDA and also spent time working with Google on advising on their medical and health policy. To my immediate left is Dr. Larry Bucshon. Sorry, doctor, forgive my manners. Would you prefer congressman or doctor?
Oh, I usually go with doctor because they're more popular than congressman.
Well, fair point. I think we're in need of both. But as you heard from Chris Coburn, Dr. Bucshon trained as a cardiothoracic surgeon where he practiced in Evansville, Indiana, before joining Congress in 2010 and up until just earlier in this year. Thank you both so much for joining us today. And before we dive into any policy questions, I was hoping to just start with obviously as a cardiologist and a cardiac surgeon, why Washington would be one. But importantly, what was one of the things that jumped out to you that was so different from practicing medicine when you landed in Washington itself?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and good morning, everyone. I had always been interested in public policy and politics for many years. Really starting back in my residency when I started to see the interaction between healthcare providers and governments, whether that's local, state, or federal. And so, the decision-making process as a physician versus a member of Congress is very similar. You identify a problem, you try to find a solution, and then you try to implement that solution. The only difference is you can do that in less than a day in medicine, and it might take you a decade in Congress. That's true. But the thought process is very similar. I think medical people are very well suited to public policy and positions where you work on public policy.
Thank you. Dr. Califf.
Well, I too had always been interested in politics. The family table often was politics. And as I like to say, I was there at the beginning. My classmate in junior high and high school was Lee Atwater, who was the founder of the Republican strategy that had such an influence. He and I were sort of arch enemies, I would say, but good friends at the same time, which I would hope is something that will come forward. But I never thought about being in the political sphere until, we started doing global clinical trials and had a lot of interactions with the FDA. So I wasn't really entering politics as much as I grew to admire the process by which evidence is collected, weighed and publicly discussed, and then decided upon. Last thing I'll say is being an FDA commissioner is a lot like running ICUs, which is what I did as a cardiologist. You come into work every day, you never know what's going to hit you about something you didn't know anything about until it happened. We were talking in the warm-up room there the day I was confirmed. This second time around was the day of the big infant formula recall. was handed to me. Welcome to the FDA. We're going to shut down infant formula for 40% of the supply.
Wow. And curious, what's one thing you miss from your prior careers?
The patient interactions, and I think particularly, I'll just boast about cardiovascular medicine a little bit. I mean, it's an area where you see problems and you can make them better, and you can actually see the person get better. Sometimes it doesn't go that way, but that early gratification, which is what you talked about, that you make a difference, often in the political sphere, you don't feel that way.
I'd say the same. I mean, patients and families is what I miss most. I haven't done surgery since July of 2010, but I miss the patients, the families, the daily interaction with people. And honestly, my political staff, when I first got into Congress, everywhere we went, someone would come up to me and say, Dr. Bucshon, you operated on me or my mother, or it was striking. And so, seeing those results and the difference you made is the piece I miss, the people.
Well, thanks. Thank you both for sharing that. Obviously, if we turn towards some of the policy issues, and we would encourage questions from the audience. If someone could help me reset the iPad, I'll be able to see those questions, but we would encourage them. You have to enter them through the app. So obviously, there's been the public trust in scientific institutions, to say the least, has been tested. And I'd be curious as to your thoughts of what do you see as the biggest factor contributing to that erosion of trust? And what's one concrete step that each of you could recommend to try to restore that trust?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think you have to go to pre-COVID and post-COVID. I mean, there's two different pieces to this. Yeah. Pre-COVID, I think overall, our society, we've started to lose some faith in not only the government institutions, but in traditional institutions in general across our society. That's pre-COVID. Post-COVID, I think, unfortunately, and I was in Congress then, I think, unfortunately, political people on both sides of the aisle, and I watched this happen in real time, that don't really understand, in my view, in both political parties, medicine and the process and the people and the history of how things work, and started to, I think, use COVID, use medicine, and use the fear that people had for political purposes, which I strongly disagree with as a physician. And I think, in my view, that has exacerbated the problem in the post-COVID era to the point where, now we're trying to reconstitute those things. One of the biggest things I think we need to do is regain confidence in institutions like the CDC and the FDA. And I think we will, but politicians need to temper the narrative and need to understand the situation. And where they don't understand it, allow people that do to help the American people bring back that confidence.
Well, I was studying misinformation academically well before COVID, and one thing I think most people do realize this, that skepticism and distrust of institutions is deeply embedded in American culture.
Well, that's true.
Going way back. And then I think the internet came along and accelerated things that were already happening, and then COVID really accelerated. I agree with you on that. But I do think we have to come to grips with what's happening in social media and the internet. There's a book that Yuval Harari wrote, many people have read, Sapiens, his first book. The second one is on the history of information networks. And the point he makes is that even if you look at the printing press, what followed the printing press was almost 200 years of the Dark Ages, where the main thing that happened was proliferation of the idea that your next door neighbor could be a witch and should be hung. And a lot of people were killed because of just access to spreading information. And his point is the bad guys win when there's an immediate proliferation, and we've got the ultimate going on right now. Another great quote from him is that truth is behind the paywall, lies are free. In other words, if you want to make it up, you just make it up. And you can, I worked at Alphabet for 6 years between my FDA stints. And part of the reason I did it was to try to understand this. And I did not come away with solutions to the problem. If you want to make it up, you can make it up and you can iterate quickly and find your place. So if you're selling something or trying to promote lies, if you're telling the truth, you have an obligation to spend some time working on it and also acknowledge the uncertainty, which makes it harder to get your point across. And the last point I'd make is that it's not just scientific institutions. If you look at confidence in large biomedical healthcare delivery systems, it's dropping like a stone also. So this is not just a matter of science, it's a matter of belief in a system that most of us grow up believing in, that we study things, we figure out what the problem is, we try to address the problem, we gather evidence. And what's taking its place is influencers on social media.
How do you think we should handle that? In the case of my own children, they've grown up with nothing but their entire lives have been exposed to social media. And how do you handle it in your own family with kids or grandkids?
Not well. Yeah. I will say, we have heated discussions in our family about this with multiple points of view. And my grandson, who has my same birthday, I'm turning 74, he's turning 11 coming up in just next month, actually the end of this month. I think that we don't know how to come to grips with it. Not that I would shamelessly promote something, but I have a Substack, and I would urge people, if you get a chance, look at the latest installment. One of our cardiology fellows at the peak of career sent me a note about her pregnancy. And how did she find out what to do practically with her own pregnancy? Because she couldn't, even being a medical person, you can only see the obstetrician a certain number of times. It was TikTok. But then she went through all the things that she saw on TikTok that looked equally as convincing, that were actually dangerous for pregnant women to do. And what do we teach medical students or nursing students or pharmacy students about this? Nothing, as far as I can tell. And yet this is the world that our patients are living in. Yeah. There are remedies in it. You asked one thing we could do. I think the most important thing right now is be aware and be socially active, because one thing that is proven is the best remedy to misinformation is a personal interaction with someone that's trusted. And nurses are number one trusted, doctors are a distant second.
That is true. Well, I have adult children, so my kids are 32, 30, 27, and 21, so I have a 6-year gap. And I'll just comment, I agree with all of what Dr. Califf just said. Just within our own household, we just educated the children, our kids when they were little about, but social media really kicked in after my first two, and so the last two, especially my 21-year-old. And so I think it's up to us individually in our households, number one, to educate our own children the best we can. But I think we need more educational institutions to pick up on this process, starting when kids are 5 years old in kindergarten, about what's on the internet, what the internet means, what social media means, and the fact that everything you read isn't true. Some things are.
Now, Patrick, you may want to comment on this, but I've given up hope that our large academic institutions are going to deal with this. So I'm working with students now to develop chapters at the institutions to disrupt things, and it's fascinating to see how much they know and want to know about this world that they're living in. And
I'm talking more about like grade school, like educational institutions, it's schools, and so kids understand it. But here's the good news, right? The difference between my 32 and 30-year-olds and my 21-year-olds. My 21-year-old and all, she goes to the University of Texas, but her and her colleagues are disconnecting themselves from social media because that generation, what they call them, Gen Z now, are starting to be disgruntled with social media because of all of this things that are on there, and are actually pulling away from it and have I'm just speaking for her and her friends. So I think, with a little bit more push, we can get people to start to disconnect some and use it for the good things that are there, but also recognize the downsides. So I think you're starting to see a little bit of a shift. Just from 32 to age 21, there's a difference.
Yeah, let's accelerate that shift.
We need to.
The students blew me away when they said, I didn't realize this, they're still memorizing note cards to pass the boards. I mean, everything you need to know is sitting there on your cell phone in terms of facts. What they're not apparently being taught very well is what do you do with all that information?
Yeah, that's true.
That's where we need to focus.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's a tsunami of information out there, obviously.
And a high percentage of it inaccurate.
Yeah. Well, I did want to turn to a topic where there's been tension between the executive and the legislative branches, and that was the role of lab-developed tests. And that's an area that's been a source of tension between Congress and the FDA. And Dr. Bucshon, you've argued for a legislative solution through things like the VALID Act.
Yeah.
And while Dr. Califf moved forward at the FDA with a rule. And what has been so difficult about finding common ground on these tests? And what's the fundamental philosophical, practical disagreement?
Well, I mean, Diana DeGette, who's a congresswoman from Colorado, still is in Congress, and I had legislation for many years. Many of you in this room agree with it, many of you do not. But we're talking about laboratory-developed tests that are developed within an institution, and not ones that are developed by industry and then go through the regular process. And there's some disagreement about whether CMS, through a law called CLIA, that does regulate the labs, actually will regulate those laboratory tests also, and they really do not. And so the question is, should the FDA, they're not regulated by FDA either, should the FDA regulate them or not, or should we revise CLIA? And there's just been a disagreement between industry, between institutions, between patient groups and academic centers that do develop these tests about what the impact would be. Many think it would potentially stymie innovation and slow that down. That's one viewpoint. From my perspective, I think I came down on the side of we don't want that to happen, but we also want to make sure there's patient safety. So it's a very complicated situation about to decide what you do about that. And then the reality is if you look at the money involved, and I hate to do that, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that is part of it also. And so that's why it's difficult.
Okay, look, I've been a political appointee twice. I'm turning 74 in a couple of weeks. I'm not looking for a job, and I'm not looking for an NIH grant. So let me just tell you what I think. First of all, I agree completely with Dr. and Congressman Bucshon. I think they had a good solution in the VALID Act. Yeah. What was the problem? It was academic medical centers whose financial interests were being threatened.
Yeah.
And I also have to object to calling the medical products industry and academic medicine not an industry. It is a huge industry with tremendous sway on Capitol Hill with lobbying that goes on every day. So we were defeated by the academic medical center interest. And what goes on in academic medical centers, I used to spend a lot of time on this back at Duke, is you don't get paid well for laboratory tests. So it's embedded in things like cancer care where the money comes in. So the laboratorians feel like they can't survive unless they have their own thing. Yeah. And the deans and CEOs have too many other things to worry about. I used to make rounds and talk to them about this. Because I started my career as someone studying diagnostic tests. This is ridiculous what we're doing in this country. Innovation is great, but free-range chickens running around selling tests without the capability of figuring out what the tests actually mean, I think is a huge mistake. These guys got it right. They actually worked across the aisle as Democrats and Republicans. Yeah. The AMCs defeated it out of financial interest. You were going to ask about an example, so let me just
Sure.
raise the ante one. My little brother just died of pancreatic cancer, and he was an orthopedic surgeon. I'm still recovering, you can tell. You go to one cancer center, you get one test. You go to you get a different test. They don't agree with each other. There's no system where people that are working on these things say, let's develop the best test and make it available for everybody. And I think that's what their bill was oriented
That's what
towards
we were
doing.
trying to
Not
do.
stopping innovation, but putting the rails on innovation so we didn't have people getting radically different advice and information from our nation's best places because they can't work together.
Yeah, fair point.
And I think, let me just add to that, and the reason I thought this was important is because of genetic testing and the explosion of identifying specific genes that do this or do that, right, Dr. Califf? And
That was the case
is
with my
that
brother.
accurate or not accurate? Well, there is a regulatory blind spot that has to be probably addressed somehow.
So the reason we put the rule forward is just out of frustration. We couldn't, and of course it's been rescinded now, so the AMCs have won again. But let me just say, I love academia. I think everyone that knows me knows that. But I want academia to be what it should be, not a financialized body which is just looking after its financial interests.
Well, as someone who spent their career developing studying the genetic basis of heart disease, I think we hope to see it quickly into the consumer market as appropriate. Maybe move on to another area. I think one thing that the U.S. has faced has been a persistent challenge in the drug supply chain. You've mentioned this with formula, but also we've seen it from antibiotics to chemotherapeutics, IV fluids. And where should or and how should we solve this? Is this primarily FDA through regulation, Congress through new legislation? How do we prevent this from happening again?
Well, I'll try to keep this brief, but it's hard to do because I don't know why you're asking me questions which lead to the same culprit every time. I mean, let's remember what the nature of the problem is.
If it's AMCs again, I'm going to need a new job after we finish
Well,
this
it is.
session.
So remember that the only brand name drug that's protected by patents where we've had a shortage is anti-obesity medicines, and that was one peculiar case because of the explosion of interest that the companies didn't anticipate. Other than that, there is no shortage of prescription drugs. You get them. The shortages are all in generic drugs, and they're specifically located. The less expensive the generic drug, the more likely there is to be a shortage. Now, why is that? The reason is because our health systems banded together, formed GPOs. They're incentivized to get the lowest price. The price of the lowest cost generics is now less than the cost of making the product and distributing it. And that happened because Americans said, we can't afford to make this. Who wants to run a business where you're guaranteed to lose money? It's moved to India predominantly. The raw materials come from China. And in Indian enterprise, it's not uncommon to low bid in order to get a larger share of the business. But what's happened is because of the dynamics of GPOs and our purchasing systems and our health systems, it keeps the price low. I mean, the prime example during my tenure was the chemotherapy for ovarian cancer was $13 per dose was the price. You could not make it reliably for that price, and there was a very significant shortage of a drug that I used to use as an intern. So we could either fix this by our health systems behaving, or we can fix it through legislation. And if we do neither, we're going to continue to have shortages that are going to get worse and worse. And then I'll just throw in national security. There's no question that China making the majority of our key starting materials, which are really, I hate to say this, petroleum-based.
Yeah.
That's what our drugs are. If they cut those off, there would be a lot of Americans that would be in big trouble with their health right away. So I'm hoping a set of legislation happens that will induce the industry to move back here, and that our health systems will pay a fair price. Remember, our generic drugs are lower cost than Europe or Canada, our prescription brand name drugs are obviously much higher. So we got to fix that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I mean, I think that's all correct. It's a lot of it is economic. It's for economic reasons. And then you'll have one-offs, like, you know, we had that shortage of amoxicillin. Well, because companies look ahead about what their projected demand is, and during COVID, not as many kids got ear infections, and so when they projected that out over time, they you know, when kids started getting ear infections again, there was a shortage of amoxicillin. You didn't have the drug because it's also economic reasons, but it was for practical reasons. You know, they predicted ahead of time what their demand would be. The thing you brought up about active pharmaceutical ingredients and production overseas, particularly those coming from China, is a serious concern of the Congress. And not only for medical reasons, but for, as Dr. Califf mentioned, for national security reasons. And so I'm hopeful also that I think that we, you know, both sides, we've talked about this. I was on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We debated this. And I think it'll be a combination of legislative action and potentially some from regulatory agencies. But it's just a complicated problem. When we had the hurricane that went through North Carolina and Baxter facilities were affected, all the larger hospital systems had their IV, mostly IV fluid, not a short, but I can tell you, smaller clinics and it couldn't get IV fluid. So that's a one-off supply chain issue, right? And you had the same thing when that happened in Puerto Rico, and it's a complicated problem. But I completely agree that most of it, I think, in my view, is related to economics.
Yeah, I hate to sound like a Republican here, but I'd have to say the private sector should fix this problem. I don't know, my dad was an architect, and you would not give a contract to a firm which couldn't produce a product reliably.
That's right.
And you also would demand to have the supply chain data. So what you mentioned is really important. A lot of what happened with infant formula and with this normal saline was that manufacturers had concentrated all of their production in one big facility. So if something happened to that one facility, you were in trouble. This can be completely controlled by our health systems if they chose to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you both, and I'd love to spend the latter part of our time talking and looking towards the future. So I'm curious as to what's one area of medical innovation, whether it's AI, personalized medicine, or something else, that has the potential to fundamentally change medicine as we know it. But then the reason we're here, what's the biggest challenge it poses to our regulatory framework?
I think individualized biometric data, real time, we see this, you know, with people who are diabetic, real-time monitoring of their blood sugars. But I think that's going to continue to expand, and I think we have to figure out, you know, how to use the information. I mean, there's some privacy issues there, HIPAA issues potentially. But I think the advancement of real-time biometric data, like people that have congestive heart failure, real-time cardiac output or cardiac index, a measurement that can be followed by their clinician, and if you start to see some changes real time, medications can be adjusted. For example, you know, like I said, diabetics now with insulin pumps and real time blood sugar monitoring is kind of, I think, the tip of the iceberg on biometric data. That's where I see a potential explosion.
Well, let me preface this by saying I believe you can walk and chew gum at the same time, and I'm a cardiologist, so I love the gimmicks and gadgets and measurements and all the things that I agree it's going to be an explosion. But
how do you use it, right?
If I had to pick one thing, I'd go completely the opposite direction. What is the problem in the U.S. today? Why are we 5 years shorter life expectancy, even in Ireland? I'm going over to Ireland in October to play golf. They're crowing. They're living to be an average age of 84. It's prevention and primary care. And you say, well, what's the technology there? I really think that I'll just call it AI. It's really algorithms and digital technology should enable us to deliver prevention and primary care at a very low cost while rewarding people who do it adequately, which is a big problem right now in our system. So, you know, when you have 60% of Americans couldn't raise $5,000 for a medical emergency, I would say while I love the fancy stuff, we need to get to the basic stuff like blood pressure, lipids, tobacco use, still 30 million people smoking. And I think, I can't imagine doing that with just human labor. It's going to take human labor plus AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Dr. Bucshon, you've been a proponent of the Cures 2.0.
Yes.
Yeah, and the initiative to build on the success of the 21st Century Cures Act.
Yeah.
What are the one or two key legislative priorities that you believe are essential for the U.S. to remain a leader in biomedical innovation? Obviously, we face huge challenges currently.
We do. Number one, I have a good friend who is from the Netherlands, and he's the one that lives in Sandwich I told you about.
Yeah.
And when he finished his career in industry, he's doing a startup, and he's not from the Boston area, but he moved to Sandwich because of Boston. And he tells me that today the United States is still the best place in the world to do this type of work, innovative work. So, I mean, I think and I don't have any specifics, but I think what we need to continue to do is we need to look at barriers that maybe prevent innovative people based on the regulatory process from being innovative. And again, I don't have any, right now, one button I would push to make that happen. But I think we do need to, again, talk to innovators and ask them from a regulatory standpoint, from a legislative standpoint, what are the biggest issues today that has created this impression that a lot of innovation and development is gravitating away from the United States, and fix those things. So I don't have a specific button to push, but I think there are barriers sometimes, and whether that is the availability of research dollars from the federal government, which has been retracting in the current administration, whether that's more engagement more than they already do from the private sector in private sector funded, whether that's the difficulty in doing clinical trials and getting a diverse population of people to participate in clinical trials. I also worked on that issue with Dr. Ruiz from California. We need to take down those barriers.
Well, first of all, I'd say we need a Cures 2.0 for food. I'll just point out that MAHA has done a service by making it popular to recognize that our food environment is one of the worst things for American health today, and it needs to be fixed. And I'm all okay with my Fruit Loops being less colorful, but you're not going to fix this problem by taking away some colorful dyes, which have never been shown to actually have an effect on health in the way we normally think about evidence. But it's okay to do that. What we've got to do is change the food environment so people without a lot of money can get healthy food, and the food system is incentivized to provide that. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff there that could be done that's different than the direction HHS is currently going. I'd also point out that one very specific thing that's come up is, we had an issue with phase 1 cardiovascular device trials. You may have been involved in this, I don't know, but we recognized they were all being done outside the US, and we recognized that and fixed it. So now the majority of phase 1 trials in cardiovascular devices are done in the US. So we got the same issue now with drug trials. Many of them are being done in China, and I think we need a very specific fix there as part of it. But I also think there's a lot of nips and tucks, which I think is what you're referring to in 2.0 that could identify what didn't get fixed in Cures 2.0. When I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Bucshon and Diana DeGette and Upton and others that made that happen. I think it made a big difference to FDA.
I think it did.
And there's more that we can do.
Yeah. Thank you both. You know, with the rapid development of artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms permeating healthcare, I'm sure we have folks working on it in the audience. How does the FDA need to adapt to keep up with that pace of change? You mentioned one example of having studies done here in the States, but other ideas for how to keep up with what is really a deluge of new devices, new algorithms?
Yeah, I could be wrong about this, and I'm going to write a lot about this as an old academic. I just write about stuff that doesn't necessarily affect anything. But I really think, first of all, I think the FDA basically got it right before my time. And if you look at the guidances from 10 years ago about algorithms, I think there's a lot of stuff in there which is right. But I think in general, AI ought to be regulated more like the food system than like the traditional medical product system. Remember that the food system is regulated through a collaboration that involves county, states, the federal government, and every element from the farm all the way through the distribution to the grocery stores and restaurants. And what it's guided by is 10 fundamental rules called the FSMA rules, Food Safety Modernization Act. And they're not highly specific, but they're principles that everyone agreed on that you needed to abide by. And everyone is responsible for keeping other people honest. And basically our food is pretty safe. There's some problems. It's not perfect. But you wouldn't expect an FDA inspector to be on site every day inspecting the food. And I think AI is so pervasive and is going to become even more pervasive that the idea that a bunch of regulators can look at every algorithm as it changes and fix it is wrong. But what could happen is the health systems that are implementing AI and the companies implementing it could work together under a set of principles. And I'll just say the one most important thing, which no health system that I know of in the US can do today, is that we know now that generative AI needs to be validated in the environment in which it's being used. And that means that each health system needs to be able to validate AI algorithms in place within their health systems. That means you have to know who your patients are and what happens to them over time. And one of our biggest problems right now is health systems don't know who's dead and alive, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, because when you're dead, you're not of interest anymore from the billing perspective, which is how it runs. So we need a system where you can validate in place. I actually think, I'm optimistic that this is going to happen because some bad things are going to happen. It'll lead to a lot of discussion about what regulation is needed. And I do think this is a case where the government just can't do it. It's too pervasive and big.
Yeah.
Can I just comment about medical training from a physician's perspective? I think I interacted with a large medical group of people, radiology driven, about the use of AI, particularly in radiology. And the one thing that look, I'm a big proponent of technology, as you probably have seen with some of my comments, but I'm hopeful that we can create a balance, but in medicine, in clinical medicine, between the use of AI and the continued engagement of people. Because I think particularly in the training setting, one of the biggest risks is, the tendency to think that AI is going to be able to always, give you the right diagnosis and the right treatment. And it's going to be extremely, extremely helpful, and in many cases that is true. But I just firmly believe, looking at the data on the use of the people that have data on the use of AI, particularly like in reading mammograms for women, about the additive benefit of AI, but not using it exclusively without the input, I think, of the human radiologist still having some input there. So
I
That's
completely
my,
agree with that.
that's my concern in the training setting of MD, that we get overconfident and think that the government or whatever can solve all those AI problems, right? We still have to have human engagement.
I completely agree. The other thing I would just add, not that I ever try to be provocative, but what I would say, if you think about AI like any other equation, there's a bunch of stuff, and then there's a dependent variable. And I think the question is, what's the dependent variable that we're trying to solve for? And I think whoever controls that dependent variable is going to really decide whether AI is a destructive instrument or it's a helpful instrument. Right now in big tech, in daily life, there's some very destructive things because the dependent variable is the amount of time you spend doom scrolling and looking at stuff which is incited by negative and adversarial stuff. But I think our system is totally out of balance now with finances versus patient outcomes. It's being driven mostly now by financial outcomes, which are not adequately aligned with the well-being of the patients we're supposed to be serving. And I'm not arguing that we can just do away with finances, but I think we've got to get some balance back in that dependent variable. Right now, we talked about this a little bit, we have a system which is sub-optimized. That is, every part of it is trying to optimize its own finances so that the sum is much less than the parts. The whole is much less than the sum of the parts. Because you try to optimize your profit even if it hurts something which patients need elsewhere. We've got to get to the point where we're using AI with the patient outcome as the most important element that we're looking at.
Yeah, thanks. And there's obviously a clear disconnect between these pivotal trials, large-scale pivotal trials that you ran to change the face of myocardial infarction management and the relatively small scale of the studies to date that are used to bring these algorithms forward. We just have a minute left, and I would be curious, Dr. Bucshon grew up in Indiana, southwest corner of the state. I grew up in Ohio next door. For folks who are not familiar with the 8th, it's about 2/3 the size of Massachusetts.
Yeah,
So
my district.
Your district, yes, may have 1/10 the population, but it's huge. So what would you tell that kid if you look forward, that next generation of physician, scientist, or policymaker? What can they do to make a real difference in healthcare in the future?
Well, you got to get into the arena. One of my favorite quotes is from Teddy Roosevelt. Asks, you have to determine what your passion is. Get yourself in the arena, and don't get distracted by the noise. I grew up in a town of 1,500 people in central Illinois. My dad was a coal miner. My mom was a nurse, and that was basically the message that I got from my parents. Thank God. And so I would say be optimistic, identify your passion. Medicine and medical science, medical research is still a very, I think, noble and place to be. And get into the arena. Step out there, be optimistic, and chart your course. And try to ignore the noise around you that might be taking you in a different direction. Yeah. I know that kind of sounds funny, but hey, I'm a dad of 4. What can I say?
Dr. Califf?
Yeah, a lot of us have that Teddy Roosevelt quote. I actually write it down every morning to keep me going. Though my face is marred with blood and sweat and dust, I am in the arena and not on the sidelines, but giving commentary. And I think that's a really important element. I completely agree with it. And I would say to a young person, this is a time when you can really make a difference. I'm a proponent of Humpty Dumpty is the right analogy for what's going on right now. We're seeing a disintegration, in my view, of our health systems and some of the basic things like vaccinations that we depend on for good health. And it will reach a point where people will react to it, and then they're going to ask the question, how do we put it back together? And what an amazing time to be a young person with the good ideas. We shouldn't put it back together the way it was before this administration. That wasn't so great either. I don't like what's going on now, but there's got to be a better future that takes into account all these things. And I think us old people are not going to have those ideas. It's a great time for a young person to make a difference.
Yeah, so science has never been more exciting than it is at present.
I would agree.
Well, thank you both so much. I mean, despite our polarizing times in Congress and across our country, these types of bipartisan discussions are incredibly helpful. It's nice to see how you've both worked together over the years to try to advance healthcare for our patients. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.